Hey scholars, Professor Dinner here. Hope you're all doing well. This is a video for the PowerPoints for chapters 3 and 6. So that PowerPoint presentation is available on the module. Same module where you clicked on the link for this video. So these chapters are dealing with perceiving the self and others, and then of course culture. So chapter 3 is all about the nature of self and who we are and where we came from and self-concept and all that kind of stuff. Chapter 6 is on culture. On this PowerPoint, as you can see, there's some I have some notes in there, so feel free to follow along with those notes. Take those notes for what you like. And as I mentioned before, I recommend that you have your book open in front of you. I recommend that you have already read these chapters prior to listening to this video. And if you haven't, if you're listening to the video first, make sure at some point that you do read the chapters. Because I don't touch on everything in the chapter, but I highlight a variety of things, and um, I go deep into some topics, and there's others that I don't touch on. So do make sure that you read the whole chapter to give yourself a context for what I'm talking about in this video. So that second slide talks about has a quotation from Mark Twain. Hopefully you get the irony and the joke. He said, Mark Twain said that he saw how much his father changed in those 7 years from age 14 to 21. Obviously, the joke is that his father didn't change at all, but he changed, right? The way he saw his father at 14 was completely different than the way he saw his father at 21. How we perceive anything generally is a function of comparison. How something tastes. If you're eating something and you say that tastes really good, well, compared to what? You're eating like your favorite kind of whatever, your favorite enchilada, and you say this enchilada is delicious. Well, compared to what? Compared to the one I had the other day at the other restaurant, it wasn't as good. So how we perceive things is a function of comparison. Um, if you were to drink fresh well water, I've never had fresh well water, but from what I've heard, fresh well water is generally 60 degrees. It's always 60 degrees. So when you drink that fresh well water in the summertime and it's hot and you're working outside, that fresh well water at 60 degrees is going to taste nice and cool and cold, and it's going to be refreshing, right? It's going to cool you down a little bit. But if you have that same well water in the wintertime and it's freezing cold outside, well, now that well water is not going to taste cool and refreshing per se. It's going to almost taste like warm because it's really cold outside and your face is cold and your body is cold. The point is, it's all a function of comparison, like how it feels, how we perceive the temperature of the water is what we compare it to. But it's important to keep in mind like what we're actually looking at. The water didn't change, but our perception changed because of the situational features of our environment. So perception is a complex thing. So I wanted to show a little video. Click on the video on slide 4, where these two babies are talking, so to speak. They're talking. There's this concept called cryptophagia. Before we perceive anything, we have to understand what reality is. And so if reality is co-constructed, and in order for something to be understood, there has to be a shared consensus. If I'm walking by you on the street and I do this, there's a shared consensus as to what that means. Hello, goodbye, how's it going, right? There's no real confusion. It's not like this could mean something like I have a stomachache. No one's going to think like, oh, he must have a stomachache. Well, that doesn't make sense because there's no shared consensus that would mean that that's a stomachache. So that's how we understand anything. How we understand reality is that there's a shared consensus of what certain things mean. So with this video, these two babies are talking. Hey, I'm looking at these babies and it looks like they're having a full-on conversation. Are they having communication? Is there a shared consensus? Do they actually have understanding of one another? We don't know because no one can really confirm that. But it's just a video that should hopefully make you smile and laugh a little bit. So reality is something that's complex. It's co-constructed and it's socially constructed. As communication scholars, as communication students, our goal is to speak in a way that leads to understanding for shared meaning. We want to have shared meaning. When you're having a conversation with someone, we're not trying to confuse the person. I'm not trying to confuse you. You don't want to be confused by what I'm saying. But research shows that oftentimes there's only 25 to 50% accuracy in explaining behavior. In other words, if I were to tell you something, if I were to explain my reasons for, let's say, something like a complex issue, like I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to end my relationship with this person, and you ask me like, well, why? And I tell you in detail, well, here's why I'm going to make this major decision. And and you listen to me, and you're taking it all in, and you say like, okay, so what I hear you saying is, and you repeat back to me what you think I said. um, I might say, oh, that's about 40% accurate, if that makes sense. So in other words, it's not that the I mean, part of the issue is that communication is inherently unclear. And hopefully that doesn't discourage you. That's just the nature of communication. Our goal is to speak clearly. And then when we don't understand things, we continue communicating until we reach some level of shared understanding. But it's important to keep that in mind, because oftentimes we get frustrated when I explain, I might be explaining something to a person and they're looking at me and they're like, I don't get it. And I might be like, well, why don't you get it? Like, I'm being so clear. I'm explaining it so well. Um, and it's not that it's the person's fault or my fault. It's just the nature of communication. I might be explaining one thing to a group of 100 people, and in that group of 100 people, some people are like, yeah, I totally get what you're saying. This is what it means. I'm like, yeah, that's like 95% accurate. Like, you totally got it. And other people might say, like, well, this is what I think you're saying. And I might say, well, that's about 20% accurate. Well, I said the same message to everyone, but we all process information differently. We all perceive things differently. The perception process is the same, but how our brains do that differs as a function of things like how you're brought up, how you understand things, just the way that you learn, the way that you process information. Um, is it would like Do you want to have complete understanding? If you always understood 100% of what everyone said, there'd be no need for further communication, for clarification, for practicing patience, for all those types of things. So it's not that complete understanding is bad or good. It's just it's important to be aware of the nature of um, perception. So I'm moving on to slide 7. So slide 7, I have that thing where it says first order reality, second order reality. First order reality is the observable qualities that you can see. So if you see the picture of the grandma and her grandchild, you might say first order reality is I see a grandma giving a grandchild a hug. That's what I've observed. Those are the observable qualities. And then second order reality is attaching meaning to it. So imagine that you're uh, someone from another planet and you don't know much about humans, and you see this happening, right? You see like grandmother, first order reality, grandmother giving grandkid a hug, and they're smiling. That's what I'm observing. And then I continue watching, and I see like, okay, the smiling, the kissing, the mutual affection, the engagement between them two, and then the smile and all the happy feelings and whatnot. Well, the meaning I would attach to that is that's a good thing. Hugs are a good thing. Smiles are a good thing, right? That's the meaning I would attach to that behavior. And the perception process has 4 steps. There's selection, organization, interpretation, and negotiation. So imagine that you have this situation between a mom and her son, and then the son is, let's say, upstairs working in his room, and he hears his mom downstairs maybe sounding frustrated, or he hears his mom doing a bunch of things. Well, we have selective hearing, right? We can't attend to all messages that we hear in your environment as you're driving your car, you're walking down the street, you're walking around campus. There's so many messages that compete for attention. But when we hear something that is relevant for us, that's when we select that message and attend to that message and then begin perceiving that message. So for the son, this hypothetical example, he hears his mom getting frustrated, and he hears his name being used. He might hear his teacher's name being used. And then he goes downstairs and he's like trying to figure out what's going on, right? So then he's like organization and interpretation. His brain is starting to make sense out of what's going on. His mom's looking at the email's from his teacher. It's the email has to do with his behavior in the classroom. He's figuring it all out. And then negotiation is, as you see in my notes down there, negotiation with this viewpoint is viewing interpersonal communication as the exchange of stories. So in an interaction between two people, each person has their own narrative, and meaning is created in and among people. The meaning is happening inside of our minds. So, they're in a conversation, they're in a conflict. The mom is saying like, you're lazy, you're unmotivated. The son thinks, well, you're being unreasonable. The son thinks, hey, it's only one class, I'm doing okay in my other classes. Mom's like, unacceptable. The son is defiant. So that's conflict, right? So when it comes to how we interact with other people, we're always engaging in some form of negotiation, where we're like, okay, let's exchange stories. Like let's find some common ground. like mom got the email and here's what's going on. Like, okay, we got to find some common ground. We have to have some sort of a compromise for how we move forward in our relationship. So that's sort of a complex understanding explanation of um, the perception process. So moving on, perception checking. So oftentimes when we perceive things about other people, we're incorrect. We make incorrect conclusions about other people's behaviors. And so one of the only ways you can confirm your perceptions, like I think this person's mad, I think this person's happy, I think this person is romantically attracted to me, but we can't read minds, not yet at least, right? Haha. But we can't read minds. So before we can read minds, you can engage in a perception check. So some authors say a complete perception check has 3 parts. You describe the behavior, you provide a couple of interpretations, and you seek clarification about your interpretation. In other words, if I think you're mad at me, maybe we're roommates, and I think you're mad at me because you keep slamming the door every time you leave the room, every time you leave the house. At some point, I might do a perception check. I might say, "Hey, you, I noticed that several times, or I noticed that over the last several days, you've been slamming the door as you leave. I'm not sure if maybe you're upset or maybe with me. I'm not sure maybe if you're upset with me or you're upset at something else or you're always in a hurry. So, hey, what's going on? You're seeking clarification." And then you allow the person to respond back to you. My recommendation is to skip that middle part. Instead of telling the person what you think it means, you just describe the behavior. First order reality, right? First order reality is I noticed that you're slamming the door frequently. Over the last several days, you're slamming the door every time you leave. Period. First order reality. That's what I've observed. And before I attach any meaning to it, I'm going to ask you, can you comment on that? Is there something going on? I'm concerned, or something like that, right? Before I tell you what I think's wrong with the situation, I just ask you. And you know what? Maybe you'll open up to me. Maybe you'll think like, oh, you don't want to talk to me about it. But at least you now know that I'm aware of what's going on. Anyways, the point is you never want to assume about the meaning attached to behavior before checking your perceptions with the person who's engaging that behavior. So that's perception checking. So there's all kinds of things that influence our perception. Let's talk about a few. Slide 10, access to information. You don't know what you don't know. So I had a manager several years ago at a restaurant I worked at who, his name was Lee, and great manager. He was really intense. He was very intense about how he did managing and how he made sure that we were doing our work. It was at a restaurant that I worked at, and I liked him, but he was, and I wouldn't say that I felt uncomfortable with him, but man, he was just so intense. He was like so much like a just a very, very focused manager. And then one day, me and my buddies, who we all worked together, at this restaurant. And one day we were out surfing. And as we were out surfing, we see our manager, Lee, surfing as well. We see him out in the lineup. And we all look at each other. We're like, hey, that's Lee. And we're used to seeing him in a suit and tie, formal, very, very like business-like. And now he's like, wearing trunks and the shirt's off and he's surfing. And we're like, what? So we're like, hey, Lee, how's it going? And he sees us and we're not really sure how he's going to respond to us. And he gives us this huge smile. And he's like, hey, what's up, guys? And then we had an awesome time. We had so much fun hanging out with him. And we realized that with this new access to information, completely changed the way that we perceived who he was as a person, as a manager, as a friend, cool buddy, so to speak, outside of the restaurant. So he was one way in the restaurant and he was another way outside of the restaurant. So we kind of jokingly called him Superman Clark Kent, because he was very, very different. So he was still the same way. When we went back to work the next week, he was still the same Lee, the manager, but I completely changed my disposition towards him. I didn't feel uncomfortable. I realized, okay, that's just how he is as a manager. That doesn't define his whole personhood, so to speak. But because I had that extra access to information, it changed my perception. And then relational roles, slide 11. The more roles you take on in different relationships that you have, it changes the way that you perceive things in general. So when I became a father, that's a picture of me with my daughter after she's just I don't remember how old she was, maybe a month. She was very young. She was a baby, small enough to be sleeping right there. But when I became a father, it changed the way I looked at all babies and all kids and all humans. Because I thought, you know, uh, oh, the in my notes it said we are all someone's son or daughter. And so when I see a person, I think at one point this person's mother or father or primary caregiver, that person felt the same way in most cases. Most people, they had a primary caregiver, a mother or father, who felt the same way about them as I feel towards my children, as I felt towards my daughter. So it was a really powerful way for the way that I just understand human behavior. And I see a person, whether they're 18 or 28 or 8 weeks. It's like, okay, at some point you were a baby and you had someone who was holding you like I'm holding my daughter. So it changed the way that I view human behavior in general. And then physiology. Um, when you think about the five senses and age, as we age, our five senses begin to deteriorate. So our hearing, sight, smell, touch, and taste, all those things deteriorate and they're inhibited. And our perceptual accuracy in terms of the five senses, it changes. It changes at age. I'm 41, and in another 10 years, my senses will probably be a little bit different. My sight will be a little different. My hearing might be a little bit different. Fast forward another 10 years, it'll just continue getting worse. I can always get a hearing aid or get more glasses, but the point is our senses change, and it changes the way that we perceive our social environment. Of course, our health and fatigue, if we're in bad health or if we're always tired, imagine, when you're like super tired, you're not feeling great. It's a lot different having an intense conversation with someone, or let's say a complex conversation with someone when we're really tired, not feeling well, versus, hey, I'm up, I'm alert, I'm not tired, I'm in great health, I'm much more engaged. So that affects, like, there's so many things that affect how we perceive our social environment. Slide 13 is on sensory processing sensitivity. I would say read through that whole thing. If you don't understand all those big words, no big deal. Slide 14 has a more succinct explanation of that. But basically, sensory processing sensitivity is, in short, it's a hyper awareness of your social and physical environment. What the research shows is people who identify as being a high SPS compared to those who are a low SPS. People who are a high SPS, they tend to process subtle cues for long durations and at higher intensities in terms of our five senses. So let's say I walk into a restaurant. If I'm someone who's very high in SPS, which I would identify as high in SPS, although I haven't taken the actual survey. If I walk into a restaurant, I'm high SPS compared to someone with low SPS, I'm going to be more acutely and more hyper aware of all the types of things that I'm perceiving through my five senses. So the things I see in the restaurant, all the different stimuli that are going on in the restaurant, the things I hear, the side conversations between among the people sitting next to me with the food servers, the bartenders, the bussers. The things I smell, the things I taste, the things I touch. If I'm in a crowded place, I'm more aware of touch or that kind of thing. Not that someone with a low SPS wouldn't be aware of those, but my awareness is more intense, right? I'm processing, I'm thinking about that more at a higher intensity. So if you identify as someone who's high in SPS versus low in SPS, it affects the way that you perceive things. Okay, so we're moving on to tendencies and perception. So we have all kinds of tendencies that we tend to make. Oftentimes we make snap judgments, and maybe that's based on instinct. Some people are very intuitive, and they might meet someone and they just have this gut feeling like bad person or good person. Sometimes you're accurate, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're just stereotyping someone. Maybe you're thinking like, oh, this is a bad person, but deep down inside, you're making that decision, or you're making that perception based on a stereotype, versus based on like instinct that has nothing to do with like what a person looks like, but maybe just like this almost like a sixth sense. Like females tend to have that maternal instinct that males don't have, because males aren't females and they don't have babies. Anyhow, first impressions are kind of related to that. Like what we do in a short amount of time when we first meet someone. There's what's called the 7-11 principle. Within 7 seconds of meeting someone, we tend to make 11 impressions of the person based on the things of the five senses. So what we see, what we can smell, right? If I meet someone and the person smells a certain way, they look a certain way, their handshake's a certain way, their appearance is a certain way, we start making impressions about that person. But the thing is, we're oftentimes incorrect. We might meet someone and we think like, wow, what a great first impression. This person's going to be great for the job. Maybe, or maybe they're just really good at making first impressions. Or you meet someone who gives a really bad first impression, and you think like, ooh, geez, I don't want to hire this person because they seem like they're not a nice person. But you really can't know that much about a person if you've never met them before. You can't really know that much about them in 30 seconds, right? Because anybody can memorize a really good. I'm not discouraging you from having a good elevator speech. When if you're networking or you're meeting someone, you're going on a job interview, you need to have that. You have to have that elevator speech when someone says, "Tell me about yourself." Have that figured out, but just know that you can't really know that much about a person in 30 seconds, right? To really know someone, to know what they're like, what makes them tick, the kind of character they have and whatnot. You need to know them for a significant amount of time. On to slide 17, there's what's called the fundamental attribution error. Again, it's kind of related to first impression kind of things. Watch this video on fundamental attribution error, and hopefully hopefully that clicks with you where you're like, oh my gosh, I've done that before, or you're thinking someone's done that with me. So in other words, the fundamental attribution error is when we're primarily looking at internal explanations for a person's behavior, right? I meet someone at a party, at a networking event, or something like that, and maybe the person is maybe not really friendly. It's one thing if they're being an absolute jerk and they're berating me or something like that. Like, okay, that's one thing. But if they're just maybe not super friendly, they're not engaging in the way that I would expect them to engage. Well, I might start saying things like, "Oh, the person's not friendly. They're closed off. They're being selfish. Blah 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 blah." Right? But if I'm just doing that, I'm failing to account for external causes, external reasons that would account for their behavior. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they have an extremely high level of anxiety, and that's why they're standoffish. But I don't know. There's no way I can know from just observing someone for a few seconds or a minute. Um, so it's a fundamental attribution error. It's an error in how we attribute meanings to behaviors. So that's what that means. The fundamental attribution error. We all have a self-serving bias, so we're more charitable with judging ourselves. So if I go to a party and I'm acting like a jerk or I'm in a bad mood, I'll be like, well, I'm just having a bad day, and it's not because I'm a jerk. Like, well, of course, because I have a self-serving bias. But when I see someone else, I'm more likely. What research shows is when I see someone else acting that way, I'm more likely to say, oh, they're a jerk. So consider that the next time you meet someone and maybe they're not acting the way that you would expect them to act. And then the other one is, if you're like me, then you are me. So if you click on that link, it shows you this art project from a guy named Chase Jarvis, and it's basically doppelganger. So this guy went around, he found all these people who look identical, but they've never met and they don't know anything about each other, but they look like identical twins. So it's easy to think like you meet someone who you think they look like you, or they have similar backgrounds, values as you are, and then you just assume that they're just like you in terms of, let's say, values and personality and likes and dislikes. Maybe not. Just because you look identical to someone doesn't mean that you have anything in common with them, as you can see in the art installation. Okay, and then and that clip from When Harry Met Sally, I feel like that does a fairly good job of illustrating what actually happens in a relationship. So this is one of the final scenes with Harry Met Sally. I think they had just broken up or something like that, and then it was New Year's Eve, and then Harry started walking away, and then all of a sudden he just was like, you know what? I got to go back and tell her how I really feel. So they finally confirmed their perceptions. He finally told her all the things that she was thinking, right? Like perception check kind of thing. But yeah, watch the clip. Hopefully it makes you think of some things relevant for this these concepts. The self-concept, moving along, self-concept is something that is an ongoing thing that changes. It's a perpetual process. It's not a fixed thing. Your self-concept tends to change. It is a relatively stable thing, like the way you are. I'm hardworking and I'm enjoyable to be around, and I have a good sense of humor. That's part of your self-concept. I'm confident. I'm not confident. I'm extroverted versus introverted. Those things tend to be a little bit stable, but over time, throughout the course of your entire life, it can change. So Aaron has this Slide 20, Aaron has this metaphor for who we are, what we are, what we see ourselves as being seems to be constantly under construction and reconstruction with the architects and remodeling contractors, largely being those with whom we have close interactions. So think of you if you lived in a house for 50 years, you were born in the house, and 50 years later, you're still in the house. It's changed quite a bit, hypothetically. The walls are different, the paint's different, the carpet's different, the floor's different, the windows are different, the plumbing's different, the electrical's different, and all of those things have changed because of hired help, right? Because of you hired tradespersons to come in and do that work, architects, contractors, etc. And the house is still the same. The physical address is still the same. It's still on the same foundation, but it's changed quite a bit. So analogous to that, as who you are as a person in terms of your self concept, is largely affected by not contractors and architects, but friends, family members, coaches, teachers, pastors, everybody who has basically talked to you throughout your life, who have told you things about yourself, the people that you've talked to about things, how I make sense of who I am as a person, especially as I'm younger. The way I make sense of myself is largely a function of what people have told me my whole life. And maybe that's great for you. Maybe you've been told great things about who you are as a person. But unfortunately, that can be a really negative thing. If you've been told negative things your whole life, if you've been told you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're never going to make it, you might start believing it. But just know that regardless of what you've been told your whole life, you can still change that, right? If you don't like what you've been telling, if you don't like the architects and contractors, get new ones, right? Easier said than done, because maybe those architects and contractors are family members, and it's not exactly easy just to get new family members, but hopefully you get the idea. Hopefully you see what I'm getting at. So that's one way to think about self-concept. Slide 21, different than self-esteem. Self-esteem is the subjective evaluations of self-worth. Essentially, self-esteem is asking is dealing with how I feel about myself at any particular time. Self-complexity deals with the number of self-aspects that we have. And so high self-complexity, people who have high self-complexity tend to do a better job of coping with the negative life events compared to those with low self-complexity, specifically the trauma that's associated with negative life events. And what I mean by trauma would be something like, I have a job interview and I don't get it. There's trauma associated with that. I study for an exam, I don't get a good grade. There's trauma associated with that. It's my first day on the job and I spilled coffee on my shirt. There's trauma associated with that, right? So any sort of a negative life event, an unfortunate life event, there's some sort of trauma that's associated with that. And the more self-complexity you have, the more social circles that you're involved in, the more hats that you wear, the more likely you are to do a better job of coping with that. You have more people to give you social support and all that kind of stuff. You have other things to keep yourselves busy, as opposed to someone who, let's say, if you work, if your entire life revolves around one thing, sports or work, and that's all you do. All you do is work. You work 14 hours a day and you don't do anything else. Your self-complexity would be lower. So it's more challenging to deal with. It's more challenging to cope with the trauma that's associated with the negative life events. So it's good. It's good to be involved. Okay. The self-concept has a certain level of subjectivity to it. So if you're looking at slide 23, oftentimes we might get distorted feedback about our performance on something as an employee, as a worker, or whatever. You work in the customer service industry, you see a negative comment on Yelp, and that can give us a distorted sense of our self-concept, even if it's from one negative comment. You might have 1,000 positive comments, and then one of those is negative. You might have 1,000 comments, and if one or two are really nasty, it's like, yeah, there's 998 positive comments, but there's 2 comments that are really nasty. And most people say, like, yeah, so don't even think about them. And it's like, yeah, but it's hard not to. So it's important to realize, like, just because like it's there, just because you have a nasty comment, doesn't mean that you have to give it life. I mean, you can choose, excuse me, not to give it life. Easier said than done. Slide 24. That's the former or current, I'm not sure, CEO of Spanx. That's a undergarment company. So it's Sarah Blakely talking about her whole business model when it comes to making mistakes within her company and how she deals with that. But she talks about how her father, growing up as a kid, how her father basically dealt with failure, and so failure is not trying things. So watch that video; it was really good. Hopefully, it makes you think of some things. Um, so there's I have that slide 25 self-esteem task force. So there's been so much emphasis placed on self-esteem, and back in the 80s, the state of California approved a budget of something like almost $300,000 to basically have people go around to public schools all over California to teach about self-esteem. I was part of it. It's called Project Self-Esteem, PSA. It was cool. It was fun. I think it probably increased my self-esteem. But what they said was, their argument was, if we can increase self-esteem, then we can probably lower crime, teen pregnancy, drug abuse, school underachievement, and pollution, among other things. So there's a large misunderstanding between self-esteem and all these other issues, like academic achievement or um, drug abuse or pollution. Like I don't know the connection. I'm not sure how they justified that, but they thought if people felt better about themselves, they're less likely to engage in risky behaviors. None of that's supported. Like if none of their findings supported the hypotheses. If you want to boost school achievement, academic achievement, then work on studying and that and whatnot, not self-esteem. Nevertheless, self-esteem is still important, and it's important to be aware of it. So I have the next slide on slide 26 has to do with self-fulfilling prophecy, and self-fulfilling prophecy, page 67 of our textbook talks about it. It can be self-imposed or other imposed. Like I can have a self-fulfilling prophecy for myself, like I'm going to do well and I behave accordingly. Or it can be other imposed, where maybe I'm telling someone like, hey, you're going to do great on this exam and you need to behave accordingly, and I'm going to hold you accountable for studying and whatnot. So the way self-fulfilling prophecy might work is you hold an expectation about yourself, you behave accordingly, it comes to pass, and there's a reinforcement. So I'm going to get the highest grade I've ever gotten on this exam. I behave accordingly. I start studying differently. I go meet with tutors. I have a study group, right? I'm behaving, my behaviors are supporting that expectation. If I just said, I'm going to get the best grade I've ever gotten this exam, and I don't change my behaviors, well, I can't expect that I'm actually going to change. If I just like wish it into existence, it doesn't work that way. That's like a fairy tale, right? So, but if my behaviors, if my actual behaviors are actually supporting that expectation, it's more likely to occur, right? So what happens? I take the exam and I get the best grade I've ever got. So that expectation comes to pass, and then there's a reinforcement of the original expectation. And I say, you see, I knew it would happen. I knew it would pay off, right? Of course, it doesn't always work out perfectly, but that's the idea. I have that slide 27 where it says Sisyphean struggle, and it can kind of feel like that. As a college student, as a human, it can feel like you're just engaging in this constant battle where you're just pushing this giant boulder up a hill and then it falls back down. The story of Sisyphus from Greek mythology is that I don't know it that well, but essentially he did something wrong, and his punishment, his lifelong punishment, was he had to push this giant boulder up a hill, and then as soon as he got to the top, it would go back down, and then you have to do that all over again, day in, day out. And it can feel like that as a college student, as an adult, as a parent, as you're cleaning your room, you're cleaning the dishes, you're cleaning the kitchen, you're doing your homework, you have messes and you're cleaning up, and as soon as you like the second that you actually get caught up with something, you blink, and all of a sudden you look around and it all is back there again. You have more things that you forgot about, or just new things that are on your plate. So I want to encourage you to try to thrive as much as possible. Slide 28. You need to learn to love the learning. The actual behaviors you're engaging in, driving, parking, doing all these types of things, studying, doing homework, submitting things on Canvas. You might not love that, but hopefully you can learn to love the learning. The end result is a degree, is knowledge, is all these other things. So hopefully you can learn to love that process of learning, or love the fact that you are learning and you're acquiring knowledge. But it's challenging. You should expect to have challenges, and you can change your thoughts to try to change your circumstances. And think about people who have done great things beyond comprehension. Reading stories about them, reading books about them. I encourage you to watch this video, this YouTube video. Click on that link. It's a short video. It's like a 3.5-minute video by I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head, but he's an Australian motivational speaker, author, writer, and he tells his story of how he changed his thoughts to change his circumstances. He was given a diagnosis by a doctor saying, you won't be able to do this, and he says, I refuse to accept that diagnosis. And he changes his thoughts, he changes his behaviors, and he overcame so many things. So hopefully when you watch that video, it's very encouraging. I have what sounds like a little homework assignment. It's not an actual homework assignment, but it's something that I want you to do on your own. Basically, think about some a recent self-fulfilling prophecy that you've had relating to college or jobs or sport that you play or something like that, and just try to think through it and try to learn from that on your own. Um, it's important to remember that we are managers of our own selves. Like, we manage our own information. I have so much information and knowledge within myself, and I'm a manager of that. I'm the one who can choose to self-disclose. I can choose to modify my behavior, like self-monitoring. I can modify my behavior to accommodate a situation. I can do systematic things to try to influence people to form certain impressions of me. So it's important to remember, like, we have all these different dimensions of ourself, and we have all these selves going on, but we're the ones who are the managers of that. We manage how that works. Easier said than done, but that's important to remember. You're in control. You have the power. Other things influence that power and control, but ultimately you're the one who's making that decision on your own. Because one of the things that makes us human is volition and free will, and so we can do certain things to change our futures and environments. So that was a lot. That was a lot on self-concept. Sorry. So that was a lot on self-concept, and now we're moving on to culture. So slide 31. I like that quotation that says, every human is like all other humans, some other humans, and no other human. So basically, we're all alike and we're all different. That's one way to think about that. So culture is one of those things where I feel like this section is a little bit easier to follow along. A culture is a learned system of knowledge, behavior, attitudes, beliefs, values, and norms shared by a group of people. So everyone's in a culture. A co-culture is a cultural group within a larger culture. If you're in a, let's say in a classroom within Cal State Fullerton, well, your classroom is a co-culture of the larger culture of Cal State Fullerton Titans, right? There's 40,000 Titans, and you're in a classroom of 25. Well, that's a co-culture of the larger culture of Cal State Fullerton Titans. But a culture could be anything. Your group of friends is a culture. Your family unit is a culture. There's some sort of shared norms, values, beliefs, the way that you talk to each other, the things that you talk about, how you dress, how you greet each other, hug, handshake, all that kind of stuff. So that's what makes a culture a culture. Nonverbal communication is important in cross-cultural communication. I wanted you to watch this video where it says it's a video between the Queen and former First Lady Michelle Obama. And there was so much media attention to when Michelle Obama had put her hand on the Queen's back. Like, you just watch the video, and they made a big deal out of it because it's a different culture, right? So cross-cultural communication is powerful. Don't worry about the thing that says, "Where's the restroom?" It's a story that I don't have time for. Anyhow, so intercultural communication is basically when two people from different cultures interact and they have a conversation. Culture shock, slide 35. Culture shock is when you have a sense of confusion, anxiety, or stress that happens when you go into a new culture. So if you grew up in let's say in this photo, like a rural farming area, and then you visit, the big city in New York City, you might just have a culture shock because it's sights and sounds, and it's just a completely different experience. So I'm sure a lot of you had some level of culture shock. There's a variety of characteristics that make up a culture, and so I want you to read those. This is just a review. On pages 137 to 143, the authors talk about all the different characteristics of culture: low versus high context, individualism versus collectivism, comfort with uncertainty, femininity, masculinity, power distance. So the authors do a pretty good job, a detailed job of explaining all of those. So keep in mind that the authors and a lot of textbooks will say, well, the United States is more of an individualistic culture, and other countries are more of a collectivistic culture, or some countries are high context, some are low context. And I would say one clarification of that is like I don't necessarily agree with that in a sense. Like I wouldn't place an entire country as being high context or low context, but certainly there are certain cultures within certain countries that tend to be more one or less of the other. But in the United States, we have the United States is like a melting pot of so many cultures, so you can't really characterize the U.S. as one particular way. But reading through all these different characteristics of culture, hopefully will help you to understand how cultural communication takes place, intercultural communication takes place from your own experience. Maybe you've had an encounter with someone who's very different from you, and then you're reading about these different characteristics of culture, and you're thinking like, oh my gosh, like that makes so much sense. Like why I got confused, or why I didn't want to share, or why they always wanted to do stuff with me. I like doing stuff by myself, but my neighbors growing up, they always wanted to hang out together. They always wanted to eat lunch together, but I like being by myself. Well, maybe you're more individualistic and your neighbors are from a more collectivistic culture. It's not that one is better than the other. They're just different. So enjoy that. And then there's a theory called communication accommodation theory. Excuse me. There's a theory called communication accommodation theory by Howie Giles. And what he was interested in is looking at, Howie Giles was interested in looking at how people modify their accents to accommodate other people. So if you're from California and then you move to, let's say, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, over time I might start saying things like, and that was my experience. I lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana for 5 years, and I grew up in California. So after I lived there for a while, I started to accommodate their culture. I started saying things like sir and ma'am and y'all, and I started to modify my accent, not necessarily intentionally. I didn't modify my accent intentionally. It just sort of happened, but I did modify a variety of behaviors, and part of that is due to there's convergence and divergence. So when you interact with people from other cultures, we tend to adjust our communication behaviors. We either modify them or we keep them the same. When we modify behaviors, that's convergence. We're converging, we're accommodating, we're changing who we are to sort of fit in. Divergence is basically the opposite. Maybe we hyper-emphasize our own unique dominant culture, or we're not willing to change. So there's a picture of a crawfish boil. When I first went to Baton Rouge, when I had my first crawfish boil, if you don't know what that is, look it up, Google it, crawfish boil. But it's a very different way of eating. It's something that is very common in that culture. And so I said, what the heck, let's do it. So I was engaging in convergence. I got my hands into it. It's messy. You're eating with your hands. Everyone's eating with their hands off the same table. I could have said, no thanks. I'm going to take my crawfish and some veggies and potatoes and put them on a plate. And I'm going to use a fork and a knife. That would be divergence. And I'd probably be looked at really, really funny. But the point is I didn't do that. It's not that one is better than the other, convergence or divergence. It's that there are different implications for engaging in convergence or divergence. The video from slide 37, it's a cool video. It's a 2-minute video of a woman explaining the nature of accents in the South. It was like Southern accents and how they got to be the way they are. So if you ever wondered, like, how did accents change? Like, why do people speak one way in Texas and another way in Alabama and one way in Florida versus another way in another state? She explains that fairly well. She gives you like a really brief, concise history on specifically Southern accents and how they got to be the way they are. So hopefully you enjoy that. It's fun. And then there is uncertainty reduction theory by Berger and Calabrese. And what that theory suggests is that when two people meet for the first time, when strangers meet for the first time, their primary concern is to reduce uncertainty. That is a theory whose research and results were primarily based in Western culture. So in Western culture, when two people meet for the first time, their primary concern is to reduce uncertainty. By uncertainty, I mean I meet a stranger, I don't know anything about them. So the way I reduce uncertainty, I start making small talk. Hey, where you're from, where'd you go to school, who do you know, so on and so forth. And then the more information I find out about them and the more information they find out about me and the more that we find that we have things in common, that uncertainty goes away, right? I like knowing, right? Other cultures are not the same way. If in other cultures or in other countries, if your primary concern is to reduce uncertainty with a stranger, that might get met with a bad look on the face, or they might frown upon that. They might just tell you like, hey, I don't want to talk to you, or it's none of your business. It might be considered very rude or disrespectful to start engaging in small talk with someone that you don't know. for a variety of reasons. So it's important to realize, or important to consider, like, why do we like this uncertainty? Why do we dislike uncertainty in the West, like Western culture way of thinking? Something for you to ponder. There's all kinds of ways that we can bridge differences. Um, or there's a lot of barriers to bridge differences, to bridging differences. So one thing that's a barrier is assuming superiority. So when we think that we're better than other people, we think that our ways of doing things are better, our ways of doing sports or music or culture or birthdays or clothing. When I think my way is superior to another culture's way, that's ethnocentric thinking, which is inherently a toxic thing, and then it leads to other things like I think I'm better than you. I might start stereotyping. I might be prejudiced. I might just think less of you because I just think I'm better than you. That's not good. If I assume that we're similar, that can be a barrier to bridging differences. And of course, stereotyping and prejudice is not good. Stereotyping and prejudice are two different things. They're very related. They're very much related, but they're different. Prejudice is prejudging a person without a proper basis, and maybe that's there's a variety of reasons why I might prejudge a person. Maybe it's their level of education. I see a job application. I see where they went to school. I'm gonna prejudge them. So it's not so much. It could be a stereotype, but it's just like, oh, because of where you went to school or because of the city you grew up in, I'm gonna prejudge you. It's very similar to a stereotype, but stereotype is using the word all. All of this category of individuals are this way. Both bad, both you want to avoid, so that way you can adapt to other people. And the way you adapt is by seeking information, listening, asking questions, tolerating ambiguity, being mindful, adapting, tolerating ambiguity. If you look on that slide 42, there's a term called um, it's going to be called ambiguity tolerance. And so tolerance for ambiguity is the tendency to perceive ambiguous situations as desirable, and intolerance for ambiguity is the tendency to perceive ambiguous situations as sources of threat. So let's say I have a job and my manager comes in and says, "Hey, we're gonna have a complete restructuring of our organizational systems or our computer systems or the leadership. There's going to be lots of change." So let's say that's going to happen, right? If I'm a person that has a very high tolerance for ambiguity, I might see that as desirable. Oh, cool! What's going to be new and what's going to be changing, and I like surprises, right? But if I have a really low tolerance for ambiguity and I hear about all these changes that are going to happen, I might perceive that as a source of threat. Like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Are we going to lose our jobs? Is it going to change? I'm going to have to work harder. I'm going to lose money. So how you respond towards ambiguous situations has an effect on how you respond to a variety of things in life. It's good, and for the most part, it's good to have a tolerance for ambiguity. In other words, when I don't understand everything about a situation, I need to be okay with that and try not to have anxiety and try not to like keep searching for an answer when maybe there isn't one, or maybe the person doesn't want to give me an answer. I just need to be okay with not having 100% clarity on an issue. That's tolerance for ambiguity. And then the last one is a speech given by the student speaker at a college graduation at the University of Richmond, Virginia. His name is Sajid Zahir Shenoy, and he gives this excellent speech talking about culture. It's an 8-minute speech. I really encourage you to watch it. So he talks about how powerful of an impact that people had on him at this college. He talks about his experience of being one of only 3 Indian students on the entire campus of that college. And he talks about his experiences there, and he parallels them to what's going on in India and what's going on in the world. And it's a fascinating, or it's a fantastic speech. So I highly recommend that you watch this and take note on it. Okay, that's it. I know that was a lot of information to cover, but I wanted to cover, I want to be thorough and detailed with 2 chapters, chapters 3 and 6. Hope you're all doing well. I'll talk to you later. Bye.